Welcome to FAB Conversations. I am Sonu Bhasin, and FAB is Families and Business. This is a platform where we have conversations about business, about people, about family business, about business people. And even though I say it myself, these are very interesting conversations. So I urge you to subscribe to my channel, please. It is free to you, of course. Today, we have as our guest Lloyd Mathias, one of the best known marketing professionals in India. He's led the marketing teams at PepsiCo, at HP Inc., Tata Docomo, and Motorola and India in and overseas. After a distinguished career, Lloyd currently is an independent director on boards of companies and is also a partner with an early stage venture fund. He also mentors startups and young entrepreneurs. He says he's a news junkie, but since our conversation, we keep away from news and politics, but business news, of course, maybe we'll talk about it and talk to Lloyd about it. So, Lloyd, how are you today?
Excellent, Sonu. Thank you for that very warm introduction. Not sure I merit a lot of it, but always wonderful to chat with you on video conference in the real world anytime.
I know. I mean, see, this is what has happened after COVID. This has just become normalized, talking to each other on screens, which I really didn't think was possible before COVID. But and people kept talking about smart cities and less commuting. But in my mind, I just couldn't get around to it. But I'm so thankful. I mean, not thankful that COVID happened, but thankful that we've got into this video virtual mode of conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, just normalized. It suddenly made it so matter of fact. There's a time when video conferences were only for strong business calls, and now it's so often to kind of speak to one's grandparents and such like, and wish them on a video call. So
yeah. Absolutely. So, you've been a marketer for the bulk of your professional life. And marketing to me is a very misused term these days. It's very common for people to say that, I do marketing, when in fact all they do is just pure selling. So, when I was in the bank, the people who were sales executives who would pick up their bags and go sell and, sell new accounts every day. If people asked them what did they do, they said, oh, I market, I am in marketing. But I've often wondered whether it is or it was possible to sell without marketing and vice versa.
Great question, Sonu. I would say that marketing and sales are very closely intertwined. And the reason I say that is that I think they're both part of a buying continuum, right? To see one without the other is always very difficult.
Yeah.
What we're seeing today is marketing has become very performance oriented. So all marketing is to drive leads, close sales, to increase, consumer interest. I think besides that obvious part, I think where great marketing starts is in mining consumer insight.
Mining the consumer insights.
What's in the consumer's mind? Absolutely. Okay. That's where it starts. What's in the consumer's mind? How can my product or service best satisfy the consumer? Okay. And taking off from there, how do I now increase my relevance to that consumer? So he doesn't just use me, he likes me, he loves me, he even recommends it to his friends. So I think if you don't understand that aspect of the journey, no matter what business you are in, and I've kind of straddled the world of the Fortune 500 and seen small startups, I believe that if you don't start with understanding what role your product plays in the consumer's life and how it can enhance his life, then the whole thing is a little wasted. So keeping firmly focused on that is a challenge in an era where marketing has become nothing but a lead generation exercise. By video daldo and then watch out for the likes and the retweets and such like. I think it's much more than that. It's about telling a brand story and about increasing the relevance of a product in a consumer's life.
I can actually hear a bit of nostalgia in your voice when you say marketing has just become generation of leads. Classical marketing used to be quite different, and you worked with a company, Pepsi, to be specific, which is known to have done like super marketing. And since you worked there, what, according to you, differentiated Pepsi, especially with reference to marketing and classical marketing?
Yeah, I would say large consumer companies like Pepsi uh,
Yeah.
teach you one of the hardest lessons in marketing. And that starts from the fact that is a soft drink really relevant to people? And if you look at it classically, no one wakes up in the morning and says, "Ki bhai, aaj 2 baje ko Pepsi peena hai or 4 baje ko Coke," right? So to create a reason for consumers to remember you, to think about your product, then want to go out and buy a product, I think is a long journey. And
Hmm.
therefore, I believe that the least relevant products like soft drinks in a small way are great learning grounds for marketing, right? There are
Hmm.
products we can't do without that we have
Hmm.
to buy, right? You go out and buy a soap, but I think that's important too. And then, of course, you have to create brand differentiation. I think for impulse category like beverages, like snack foods, I think the challenge is marketing is integral to the product offering. If I don't remind a consumer, if I don't win a usage occasion, वो भूल
Hmm.
जाएंगे. So I really need to remember him. So that
Hmm.
way it was very exciting. The
Hmm.
other great excitement about being part of the very early stage Pepsi team, I was among the earliest employees in the country. I think it was also the comeback of the multinationals. In 1977, George
Hmm.
Fernandez kind of threw
Put
out
them
that
out.
India kind
Yeah.
of stopped global
Yeah.
companies.
Yeah.
And it's only in the early 90s that Pepsi was one of the first companies to come back in on the back of a lot of covenants with the government. So,
Yeah.
A, it was a new coming in.
Yeah.
B, it had to do big, bold, daring marketing. And thirdly, and I think most importantly, it had to vibe in a very Indian sort of a way. Because you had
Right.
loads of multinational brands that kind of translated global advertising and came into India. I think what Pepsi did was really reinvent and try to become a part of the young Indians' lives in the 90s. So whether it
Yeah.
was cricket, whether it was movies and Bollywood movies, whether it was music, indie pop music, I think Pepsi did it all. It was a cool place, great place to learn, a
Yeah.
fabulous place for a young person to have a good time, watch cricket,
Yeah.
go
Yeah.
through all the music shows. So I think
Yeah.
it was both a learning and a great life experience.
Right. I also had Alex Kuruvilla in conversation with me, and he was telling me about how their team actually got Pepsi to change their worldwide strategy of not using Michael Jackson. No, who was that guy? Not Michael Jackson. Who was the other guy?
They used Michael Jackson, Ray Charles, a lot of global
Yeah,
icons.
yeah, and they got A.R. Rahman and Juhi Chawla instead. And that is because what you said, it needed to resonate with the Indian people and not have, global icons just thrust upon,
Absolutely. In fact,
upon.
it's a lesson I learned and I took to, certainly took to both Motorola and HP. In Motorola, it's signed on Deepika Padukone. In HP, it was Deepika Padukone. In Motorola, Abhishek Bachchan. I think the idea that while global brands are great, they have great guidelines. I think India is too large a civilization to adopt something global directly, right?
Yeah,
So until you tweak it, until you bring local relevance, until you bring a lingo, yahi hai right choice, baby, mera number aayega, ye dil mange more. I think all these were what young Indians could jolly well have said themselves, right? So they were
yeah,
really adaptations of global lines, but they had
yeah,
a strong local resonance. And I
yeah.
think that's, I would say, one of the larger lessons that Pepsi just not just helped in the context of India, but taught to a whole generation of brands.
Yeah. So, the lessons that you learned in marketing, say in one company, were you easily able to take them to other companies? Because an HP selling computers is very different from selling uh, Pepsi. I mean, I would even say that, you need computers, but you don't need aerated, sugar colored water in your life, really. And then Tata Docomo, and then Motorola. How do you kind of take the learnings and apply them in different products, different categories altogether?
It was never easy. So I think that was always a difficult challenge. I think because each company comes with its own set of global ideas and what they need. Pepsi also being a consumer company was very marketing first. So it
Hmm.
was very easy to get a marketing idea through. Whereas when we look at Motorola, it was a classically conservative technology oriented company based out of Chicago. For them, the idea of not wanting to use global creative and to do local advertising and then to sign on a Bollywood star for a category where they really believed was all about technology was a difficult sell. I
Hmm.
think a lot of the learnings I had helped me make that transition. The second point I think that most business leaders globally will come across too is once they recognize that when you operate in an international market like India, which is vastly different to the markets that they're familiar with, which is largely Western Europe, the US, and even when it comes to Asia, it's really Australia, New Zealand, that if they don't adopt the local idiom, if they don't adopt the local selling and marketing strategies, the mom and pop stores, they will never succeed. And the moment you're able to showcase a couple of small wins, then suddenly you get a carte blanche. So I remember the first few months in Motorola were difficult because we were trying to do global copy, we were trying to do things differently. Until we told them that, look, we're never going to make headway in a market where there's one big, strong market leader in Nokia. Nokia then had 75% of the Indian market. And we said, we'll never make progress. And then the moment they opened up, and literally in the span of a year, we kind of trebled our market share. Suddenly, we were becoming a worthy competitor to Nokia. So I think the selling in is always difficult. I think much the same example as I went down to Tata, Docomo, and subsequently even to HP. The idea that you have to persuade the principles that it is a global connect that matters. Until your product becomes relevant to a local market, until you're able to challenge the local players in a language and a lingo that they understand, it'll never be very successful. I think that journey was really wonderful for my career.
Yeah. Normally during our conversations, I ask my guest about some personal successes and personal failures. But since I've got you, of course, I'll ask you about that as well. But before that, it'll be great to hear from you about, say, a marketing campaign that, in your opinion, failed completely and one that worked spectacularly. It can be one of your campaigns, it could be any campaign in the market, but if you can just talk about one spectacularly successful campaign and one that just tanked.
Yeah, I think on a spectacular successful campaign, I'd certainly like to speak about a most recent campaign, something we did for HP. Now, if you understand, you understand the PC category, it's a kind of very traditional category. What people really sell are a bunch of features. How much of RAM, what kind of memory, Intel chip, Microsoft.
Which an average consumer like me doesn't understand at all.
At all. But typically, most consumers, you throw them a little catalog and say, boss, I've got a 16-inch screen.
What is RAM? What is bit? What is byte? And, they just...
Absolutely, you're right. Most consumers just don't get it, including young consumers, because they're really buying a feature set. And then in that environment, we decided that let's take the whole idea that today tablets and laptops are really an extension of a young person's life, right? When he's not on his phone, he uses on his laptop. And for him, a laptop is not just an office equipment. It's a kind of place he sits in a coffee shop, in a Starbucks. It's a kind of place where he goes through Instagram Reels, he goes and watches his YouTube videos and such like. And therefore, the whole idea was about reinvention. And therefore, we actually got Deepika to play this role where she kind of walks into a flight and spots this very cool HP laptop and tells this influencer, hey, I want something. So the whole idea of reinventing the laptop, it's not just an office device. It's the kind of device that you can do a whole lot of creative expressions. You can entertain yourself, you can watch stuff, you can share, you can do things that maybe a mobile phone is more restrictive. I think that campaign flew off very well, which is the whole idea of taking your office with you, but also making it a play thing. I think that was remarkably successful. The other, which I can't resist, of course, is an original HP campaign we did, which was the whole idea of Mera Number Aayega. It was a consumer promotion.
Mera Number Aayega.
Yeah, it was a consumer promotion, but we articulated it in a manner that we said young India in the late 90s was very aspiring, right? They always wanted to get. And therefore, we used a terminology like Mera Number Aayega, and it was one of those 3 most popular lines that people played back.
So the rap song that happened, Mera Number Aayega, was a spin-off from the campaign.
On the campaign. So it was really the whole idea was about the fact that everyone's time comes, but you have to always aspire, always be ready for that big moment. And I think, those things always work well. To talk of a spectacular failure, I would say to some extent, a hugely successful product for us for Motorola was the Razr. The Razr defined the look and feel.
Razr was a phone.
It was a flip phone that you opened up. It was very stylish. This was the pre-smartphone era. And it really shook, let's say, the market leader Nokia by far. The campaign behind it tanked because it was a very global campaign. It had men in black suits. It was a very Western-oriented, very stylized campaign.
Yeah.
It virtually had no resonance with the average Indian consumer. So while the product did well, thanks to great features and a strong retail thrust and push that we put together, I think the campaign per se wasn't one of those most talked about campaigns that we aspired to. So like I said, you win some, you lose some, and that is part of the deal.
So, when we talk about failures that we ourselves undergo during our professional journey, we always talk about what did we learn from it, and therefore, what we decide we will not do, or what we decide we'll do differently. But when we talk of these multinationals, and you've talked about, one spectacular failure, I'm sure there are others. Do companies also learn from their failures?
That's a great question, Sonu. I'm not sure how well companies learn. And the reason I say so is that while for that appraisal cycle or that financial year, the failure will be well recorded, will be analyzed, will impact your bonus, will impact a little bit of how you're seen as a company.
Yeah.
The learning transfer is not as seamless. And I put down to a larger issue that companies don't have great defined learnings as they once did. The reason I say so is that
don't have what? Sorry?
codified learnings.
Codified learning.
Yeah, like the once did. The reason I say so is that, let's say back into the 80s, people tended to have long careers, 15, 20 years. You had people, and therefore the learning was well captured. You could go back into history and say, hey, which worked, what didn't work, what are the mistakes? I think right now with rapid tenures, all the way down from the CEO, right? So an average CEO tenures has shrunk to what, 2.5 years?
Yeah.
I think those learnings are not normally very well captured, so they can be reused or you can use them as a vanguard. The other reason I would say largely for many businesses is that they shuffle around their business partners, right? So your agencies, your research company, they get shuffled around.
Right.
So a lot of the learnings that at one time became part of a product brand manager, category manager, a CMO, even a CFO's role, I think some of those have got lost. And I would blame it to two things. One is shortened tenures, and the other is the lack of the rigor of actually maintaining strong databases. I mean, you would remember the importance of things like guard books, right? There was a time when every campaign got captured into a guard book. And, as a new brand manager, you could go back into history and look at all campaigns done on your particular category and your brand. I think some of those principles have got discarded. And I think that's a loss because the learnings that really need to steep into an organization's DNA is sometimes getting lost.
Now that you're talking about it, I think the thought that comes to my mind is that people have either forgotten or taken an aversion to writing. And institutional memory is all about creating these documents, notes, pothas, whatever. And, no matter how much of speaking you do, the written word just perseveres. So
that's a great insight. I totally agree because the writing down of some of these learning doesn't happen. And if that person has left the organization, then that's lost forever.
Yeah, it becomes more of an individual memory rather than an institutional memory. And I do think that institutions just fail to comprehend the importance and the urgency of creating their own institutional memories because that is what prevails. CEOs may come and CEOs may go, but these archives will remain forever. And the other thing is that what companies could do is to actually have, like everybody wants to be part of the Harvard business case studies for successes, but people should also talk about failures so that companies, at least the companies themselves, don't repeat it. It doesn't matter if their competitors do. I'm sure they'll be happy if their competitors make the same mistake, but at least the companies themselves don't need to make those mistakes.
I think that's a great point you're making, Sonu. And I said, given what you and I both spend a fair amount of our time, I think it's something that boards can slowly persuade companies to do. Which is to have a bit of codifying a lot of the learnings and storing them in a database that's easily accessible. Yeah. Much like as boards, we have access to minutes of every past board meeting in the last how many ever years. Yeah. I think that's a great initiative. But I think I'm glad you made that point.
Yeah, and also that I noticed that, when I was a young manager, anything that we needed approval for, was a long note with objective, with pros, with cons, with option A, option B, and then, recommending to bosses which one we want to choose and why.
And very often, after the end of that particular campaign, you'd go back to revisit that and talk about what you met, not met, and where did you fall short.
Absolutely. But today, for any approval, it's a PowerPoint where there are like 5 bullet points and the person explains it. But all that remains part of the institutional memory are those 5 bullet points, which don't make sense at all. So it would be good if companies, institutions started building their own institutional memories. But, since we do want to talk about, experiments that worked for you and experiments that didn't, in your career, would you want to talk about something that worked for you spectacularly and something that didn't work for you spectacularly and what you learned from it?
Yeah, I would say when it comes to what worked spectacularly, I'd certainly say that building deep relationships with partners outside of the core business. And, in a sense, I kind of, I'd start by saying that it was a learning for me that I didn't come naturally. I used to run sales and marketing for a small part of a region for Pepsi in the western part of the country. And I repeatedly had run-ins with the vendors, with my agency, because I just found they never measured up what I heard they did for the company at large, at the capital, at the national level. And after repeatedly changing teams, firing a couple of sales heads, and almost asking the agency to leave, I was then counseled by my boss then. So these are two great people, Vibha Rishi, Ravi Dhariwal, saying that, hey, you've got to start building relations with people. It's not just being, it's important just driving results. It's driving results to people. You're eventually not going to be doing everything yourself.
Yeah.
And I think a couple of very hard learnings. I remember Vibha telling me very clearly once that, have you ever sent a note of appreciation to the agency head on the work they do? I looked up to her and said, but they've not done any work that's worthy of a letter. And she said, let's try it. Find out something and try it. Right? And she said, do more than that. Maybe the next time Pepsi's doing a big cricket match at the Wankhede Stadium, can you give 20 tickets to the agency and say, hey, give it to whoever you think appropriate?
Right.
And I followed these two things much against my personal will. And a month later, I suddenly saw the agency had warmed up. Suddenly, this became a client that was respecting them, that was giving them a little bit of a positive feedback, some positive stroking.
Yeah.
And I think 6 months later, I remember it got nationally called out that Pepsi in Western region is doing the best work in the country. Great marketing, excellent go-to-market strategies. And I realized that finally, it's the people who then say, oh, this is a nice guy. It's worth working for. And of course, we've got a great brand to back it all up.
Yeah.
So I think that importance of building deep quality relations and realizing that a lot of people will work for you, not just because it's part of their job description, but because they begin to like working for you and they begin to believe that you're more than just a business associate. Right. I would say deep relationships at various levels, I think, certainly are one of the things I would say, one experience that I take. The other that I would say is a bit of a failure, I've seen it myself, but I certainly push very hard with the startups I work with, short-termism. Short-termism. I think the whole fact that everyone, short-termism is a term. I live in the startup space today, and my biggest single fear is that everything is so short. Right? A lot of startups, unfortunately, have short runways. Right? They have enough funding in the bank to keep them afloat for, let's say, 3 quarters or 4 quarters. And therefore, everything is about how do I get quick returns? And what happens in this chase for quick returns is sometimes you forget the larger picture. You do things in haste. You do things with if I'm going to put X amount of money on a campaign, how quick will I get the returns? Yeah. If I'm going to appoint a new distributor, how soon is he going to give me that kind of thing? And therefore, in that process, you tend to lose out on some of the long-term. And therefore, one of the things I caution a lot of the startups I work with, say, draw up a 2-year plan. Even if it means going slow, but try and get a few things right, because you will stumble, you will make some mistakes, but the fall won't be as bad. Whereas doing some quick, grow big, double the valuation techniques always come with a shortfall. So I would always say a more measured approach. Play for the long innings. Don't play for the here and now. It's very difficult, right? We all are aspiring to our next year's bonus. And I always say that look at least 3 years down the line, because there are a lot of things you do with a 3-year vision that you tend to ignore when you're looking at next week and next quarter. Right? And I believe that is one lesson that Startup India certainly needs to internalize far more significantly than they do today.
Yeah, my only view there, and I'm not part of the startup world as deeply as you are, but my view is that more than the startups themselves, I think it's the funders who need to have a long-term view. Because from what I've heard from all the young entrepreneurs that I interact with, is that on their own, they are happy to work on a 5-year plan. But once they get funding, there is so much of pressure to ramp up the numbers that they just get caught in all of that. So, I mean,
I'll concede that. I mean, you're a point, and like since I'm on the funding side, I totally concede. But I think the moment a founder, has the maturity to look an investor in the eye and say, look, if I do this, it sounds good. It might give you a little up in the valuation, but a year down the line, it may not be something we're proud of. I'd much rather have a gradual scale. I think the moment founders tend to have that conviction and
but the
speak out
young
to,
people,
they are.
Lloyd,
It's
they
a
don't
difficult
have
task.
the experience,
I agree.
and they have that youthful enthusiasm. And in that enthusiasm, they believe they can do it. And I'm sure they can do it. But
So,
you need to build your base very, very strongly in order to use that as a leverage to jump up. You don't want
absolutely.
your base to crumble the moment you want to use it as a springboard.
Absolutely. No, I'm totally with you, but I just try to say, and the examples I always use are, well known from the Indian startup ecosystem. I said people like Sajeev Bikhchandani, people like Deep Kalra have begun organizations that are today no longer technically startups, 24, 25 years old, the Make My
Yeah.
Trips, the Naukris. I think because they spent, let's say, 5 to 10 years in the corporate world, they were able to kind of gradually pull that curve up. And
Yeah.
today stay as strong, robust, well-established companies. I
Hmm.
said there are these, I won't say flash in the pan, but companies that have gone from 0 to 1000x in 3 years, and some of them are struggling. So I said there is value in pacing yourself. It's never an easy journey. And you rightly said investors are not very patient people because they're all dying to return to their LLPs,
I know.
funding. So I totally
Back
concede.
all the money.
Absolutely. But I still believe that, therefore, it's something both ends have to work towards. But I think founders have to hold their ground. And if they pick their 5, ideals, it has to be people who have established companies over a 10, 12-year period. We love those little, superheroes that make it to the cover of Business Today. But some of them, as you know, are also struggling for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, so before we end up, we did talk about successful campaigns and not so successful campaigns. And the ones that you talked about as a not so successful was the one where it didn't Indianize or localize enough. So, as a corollary to that question, is that we actually have a lot of young managers who watch these podcasts. Now, techies find it very easy to work anywhere in the world. Finance people find it very easy to work anywhere in the world and have job opportunities. How easy is it for a marketing professional to be able to go and work anywhere in the world and be successful?
Not as easy as for a technology or specifically a finance function where the rules remain similar. I think if a marketeer demonstrates enough enthusiasm to work deeply at insights, if he understands his craft enough to recognize that marketing is not just about turning out one great campaign, but at looking at all the elements of the consumer interest, whether it's pricing, whether it's packaging, whether it's the go-to market, whether it's the distribution. I think, therefore, when marketing gets reduced to marcons, I think it's a problem. The moment you start looking at a 360-degree approach, saying how is what I do in marketing going to impact the business, grow the business, keep the consumer there longer, make him want to spend more, make
Yeah.
him over time even want to recommend it to his friends and to other people. I think
Yeah.
once you start thinking to that, I think that's a universal trait. And I gather from my experience that business leaders recognize marketers that look at the larger picture much more than one trick ponies, right? Someone who did one great campaign because he had the right creative guy and he had a right superstar to hire. And I think that's the part that you have to demonstrate. Marketing has to demonstrate its impact on the larger business. When that happens, I think that skill is globally tradable.
And okay, just the absolutely last question. How can, the temptation that advertisers have or marketing people have to create a campaign which is far more rememberable than the product itself? How does one overcome that? And for people who may not be young enough to remember, the strongest ad that comes to mind is that I think it was a Nokia one which said one black coffee.
Ericsson, one black.
I don't even remember the brand, but I remember the ad, one black coffee. So so if I am a marketing professional listening to you through this podcast, how do I ensure that my agency doesn't get carried away or I myself don't get carried away by this lovely campaign where the product gets forgotten 20 years later, but the campaign still is vibrant in people's minds?
Great question, Sonu. I would say that how deeply is your product integrated into the campaign thought, right? I think execution is one part. You always have managers, brand managers, end mein logo bada hona chahiye, pack shot dikhna chahiye.
Logo bada bada hona chahiye.
I think that is relatively incidental. I think the issue is how deeply integrated is the product into the particular campaign, right? And to my mind, let's say if someone like Fevicol does it well. Who doesn't remember those classic visuals where the whole thing is about Fevicol ka joke, how Fevicol sticks things to life? Or I would say Cadbury's have done it brilliantly. I mean, who doesn't forget that girl dancing with gay abandon and then whipping out a chocolate and sharing with a boyfriend? So I think that moment where the product becomes integral to that entire campaign, I think that's what makes a campaign stand out. But the moment you run a campaign where product pack shot end mein bada hona chahiye, I think that's where you start losing the impact. So I think the trick is to make sure that your creative people understand and they build the product into that little 30-second or a 60-second story. That's what really makes it so endearing and so memorable.
Yeah. I mean, that ad really did make quite a bit of waves, but I believe that the client wasn't too happy because nobody remembered what the product was. But Lloyd, thank you so much for your time. Great chatting with you.
Always a pleasure, Sonu. Always lovely to chat with you.
In marketing. And I do hope that the young managers, young professionals get their little bit of learnings. And I do also hope that the older ones who are listening, the ones who are able to wield some weight in their own organizations, do create your institutional memories so that your successes and failures live on after you. So thank you. And
thank you, Sonu. Wonderful to be on your show. Always great chatting with you. And the learnings are always mutual. Looking forward.
Yeah. Thank you.